that golden thread. And I think it's so beautiful that we're ending with Buddhism today, and I'm so glad that Casey Marler Rush could join us. Here we have our symbol up front, and I just think this is the most beautiful way, because one reason we're doing this is because we want to see the commonalities. The commonalities. If only in our world we could look at our commonalities instead of all of our differences, it would be so wonderful. So we will see how the golden thread weaves through Buddhism today. Now remember, we're framing this on our 5 principles. And I talked about that earlier. God is, I am, I think, I pray, I do. And it fits beautifully with Buddhism. And just as a real quick review, here's the timelines for the religion, with Hinduism and Judaism being the oldest, and then Taoism came in about before 500 BC, Buddhism about the same time, and then Christianity and Islam, and some of the others that we are not going into in this series, but just so you can get a deal with the timeline. And so we characterize Judaism by the people seeking a full and free connection with their God through a covenant relationship. Christianity, a journey to understand the Christ nature. Islam, characterized by a zealous struggle to establish the peace of God. When we did Hinduism, a search for truth called the eternal way, the Dharma. The truth is one, the paths are many. All right, now forgive me, Casey, but this is, I'm just gonna, it's hard to get a sentence to say anything about Buddhism, but just in general, it's been the light of Asia, and it provides the most systemic and insightful spiritual psychology known to humankind. But that was an unusual description, but it is a transformative practice. So stay tuned. This is just a brief timeline for the Buddhism, and showing you before Christianity, a lot was happening with that tradition faith. So I'm going to turn this over to Casey Marler. Now I want to tell you just a real brief little bit about Casey. For over she has 25 years experience in the mental health field as a psychotherapist. And she's been practicing and studying meditation since 2002. Her teachings reflect retreat experience. I hope she tells you about a really unusual retreat experience she's had in New Mexico. And then she studied Eastern and Western teachers with an emphasis in Mahayana Buddhism. And her loving husband, Jim, who's no longer with us, and Casey, I went to their home many times for meditations, and even went to a silent retreat on Medellin. They are just wonderful. So I'm going to just turn it over to Casey now.
Thank you, Jeannie. I cannot say that I'm an expert, and I'm not a scholar.
Well, beginner's mind.
So we'll see what we can do. And I'm not proficient in the 5
Principles.
But we'll see where we go with this, right? So, so a little bit about me. I was born and raised in Texas, Southern Baptist. Part of my family, my mom and stepdad, are still Southern Baptist, and actually live here now in Arkansas. I forgot about these guys.
There we go.
Please excuse me. And then, as a young adult, got into the Methodist Church. So another part of my family's in the Methodist Church in Texas. And then I ended up in Unity, Fort Worth, with Paul as my minister.
The author of the book.
The author of the book. Yeah, and then I went and studied and practiced Hinduism, lived in an ashram, also studied shamanism, ended up studying Buddhism, and so it really landed in Buddhism that just fit me, my propensities, I guess. So kind of made it around the block a few times. I mainly study in the Mahayana and Vajrayana teachings of Buddhism, so Tibetan Buddhism and some Zen. So I have teachers in Zen. My main teachers are in Tibetan Buddhism. So Buddhism is a wide and deep subject, and there are different schools of Buddhism, and I'll touch on those a little bit. So I'm come at this from the lens of the Mahayana, Vajrayana teachings and practices. So know that the way I'm teaching or sharing with you may not be how someone in Theravada or would necessarily practice or even share the teachings. So there are different ways of practicing and teaching. So who was Buddha? So his birth name was Siddhartha Gautama. He was born in Lumbini, Nepal, actually. And he was born about 2,600 years ago, a long time ago. His mother was on the way from the Sakya region of Kapilavatthu, where they lived, to her parents, because that was the tradition, and she happened to be in Lumbini when she gave birth. So there's pilgrimage site in Lumbini as well as many places in that area of India. So it was at the foothills of Himalayas of India and Nepal that he lived and taught. And so he was born into what was called the Sakya clan. The Sakyas were the warring class, so he was in the caste system of India. So he was a warrior class. That means he had privileges. His father was a leader of the warrior class, often called a king. So, you know, he had a privileged life, right? His mother died shortly after he was born, so he was raised by her sister, who became a consort of his father. And he was raised in, you know, and they say in wealth, whatever that looked like at that time, right? Wealth and prestige. And he was trained and taught to take up the footsteps of his father, to become a warrior king, right? So he did know that, grow up in the caste system. And now the caste system, I'll just say briefly, and he did eventually he didn't try and buck the system after he became Buddha, but he definitely did have some things to say about the caste system. Caste system was, apparently my understanding, based on what was considered divine karma, each caste representing a different aspect of the cosmic human being, with Brahmins at the top. So you'd have the warrior class and then the Brahmins. And Siddhartha was seeing, you know, as he started discovering what he would later go on and research in his meditation, you could say, was the oppression by the Brahmins by extracting money and goods to do ceremonies or rituals for people. And he saw this as oppressive. So Siddhartha, as a young man, he married, he had a son, but he came, you know, he had this open heart for people, and he came to see suffering of birth, old age, sickness, and death. And he saw that even though his father was this leader and this ruler, and he could help people in a lot of ways, he could never free them of their suffering. He could never give them what they needed to truly be liberated from suffering. And this weighed on Siddhartha's heart. And this propelled him to leave his young son and his wife to become an ascetic. Now, during those times, but mostly men, would raise their families, do their due diligence to society, and as they got older, they could leave and take up the spiritual life. Well, he did this when he was young, so this was quite unusual, and his father was not happy. His father was really wanting him to follow into his footsteps. So there were many philosophies. Of course, he would have studied the Vedas. He would have been taught these things as he was growing up. There are many other philosophies that he would have learned from either formal study or from his friends. And so when he gave up the householder life and became an ascetic, he went and studied with the most renowned teachers of his time that he had in his area. So it said that he went, he studied, and he attained their levels of meditation absorption or samadhi and realized whatever they taught, but he was never satisfied. He didn't see that that ended suffering. So he continued, he even took up the austerities of, seeing the body as the problem, or the identification with the body as the problem, and so, not eating, there's a lot of the mortification of the flesh, and he saw that that didn't lead to the end of suffering that he was looking for either. So he was able to attain these great levels of samadhi, even to the point of the cessation of perception and non-perception. But he saw that when he came out of that, there was still the arising of these attachments and aversions, and there was still this level of suffering. So eventually, and we hear the story of him ending up in what is now Bodhgaya, sitting under the Bodhi tree, right? We hear this story. He decided to turn his very clear and supple mind. So as he went into these states of samadhi, then he came out and said, I'm going to turn my mind to my questions, to what is the cause of suffering, what is really going on. And that's where he found the causes of suffering and therefore the liberation. He was able, now his meditation practices obviously helped him get there, helped him to eliminate those causes within himself and then do what we call attain enlightenment, right? Or awakening, and become known as the Buddha, the awakened one. So now he taught for 45 years. That's a really long time when you think about it, 45 years. And when he taught, and then he eventually had monks, and then eventually nuns, and when he taught, he often taught based on someone's question. Now his teachings were not written down, not because there wasn't written language, but because that was seen as inferior type of learning. So the teachings were to be memorized so they could be internalized. So they were written down after his passing, where the monks came together, having memorized the teachings, and some of his monks being with him for his whole life. So being able to hear all of his teachings, and they came together and going over the teachings and decided what they agreed upon, what they felt like they had all remembered together. Those were the teachings that were written down. So the first teachings of the Buddha are called the Four Noble Truths. One of my teachers likes to say they're the Four Noble Rumors, because they're only rumored. They're rumors until we realize them for ourselves, right? I love that he said that. I was like, I never heard that before. So the Four Noble Truths, pretty obvious to us that there is suffering. That's the first one. There is suffering, right? To be in a human body, there's suffering. Now, there is suffering, like if you break your leg, that's suffering. Buddha wasn't too worried about that level of suffering. That's kind of inevitable. But he was worried about all the stuff we add onto it. And he was looking at what brought us into birth in the first place, this whole cyclic existence, and how do you end that, which is filled with suffering. Okay, so the first noble truth, life has inevitable suffering. Second one, there's a cause of our suffering. Third one, that there can be an end to it. And the fourth one, that there's a path. And that path is the 8 noble truths. All these truths here. So the teaching says the truth of suffering is to be comprehended. The cause of that suffering is to be abandoned. The cessation of that cause is to be realized. And the path leading to the cessation of suffering is to be cultivated. So I was talking about the cyclic rebirth, that's samsara. You may have heard that word before, samsara. You'll often find terms that are very much used in Hinduism and Buddhism. Oftentimes they take on a different meaning in Buddhism. So in Buddhism, you'll find that we can migrate between 6 realms that we find in samsara. These include heavenly realms, includes the human realm, the animal realm, hell realms. So these are all included in the realms of suffering in the Buddhist teachings. Now we can see these as actually existing places, or we can see these as psychological states. How many of you have experienced in one day heavenly realm? Oh, everything's wonderful and great, awesome. And then an hour later, it's the hell realm, right? It's really bad. So, and it's, our psychological states. We can move through these. So the Eightfold Path, I just want to simply say what these areas are. Obviously, any of these teachings, weeks, years, lifetime of study. So these are the 8 are broken down into 3 areas of development. So one area is wisdom, then there's morality or ethics, and then concentration. So you also often hear these written or taught as with the word right in front of them, like right understanding. This sets up in our Western minds a duality of right versus wrong, and that's really not who it's talking about. It's more of a complete or perfected understanding that we would find under wisdom. So don't think about right as, because that can really set it up to my way is the right way, or my view is the right view, right? So more of a complete and perfected understanding, a complete or perfected aspiration falls under wisdom. Morality and ethics. It's interesting what falls under this. Complete and perfected speech, complete or perfected action, complete or perfected livelihood. What we're doing out in the world, how we are taking our understanding and expressing it. And this is the foundation for compassion. Compassion isn't there without wisdom and ethics. So concentration, that area under that Eightfold Path, complete and perfected effort, complete and perfected mindfulness, and complete and perfected concentration. So the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path are the foundation for all the teachings that come after. And in the different schools of Buddhism, some of them teach them quite, forwardly, you'll see them explicitly, and others, you're like, where's the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path? I'm not hearing anybody talk about it. It's embedded in the teachings. Okay, so very wide and broad. And then you can hear the teachings on the paramitas, like these are virtues, like generosity, wisdom, persistence, patience, truthfulness, loving kindness, equanimity. These inform and help us to develop the positive qualities of ourselves. And then there's something called the Four Immeasurables, more virtues, or noble attitudes. This is the way to cultivate ourselves and how we view other people, our heart and minds towards others. This is, like Jeannie mentioned, loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy. This is the joy of other people's happiness, and equanimity. And there's different ways to even look at equanimity. So it's like the equanimity of mind, and then the equanimity of loving and kind and compassionate towards all beings. So Buddha also found that there were these 3 things that gave rise to suffering, called the 3 poisons. The first one is ignorance, and this actually gives rise to the others. And you'll have heard these others, called attachment. Have you heard that word? And aversion, right? So ignorance gives rise to attachment and aversion. Attachment is also, you can hear it referred to as greed. Aversion, you can hear it referred to as hatred. And these give rise to further afflictive emotions, jealousy, pride, anger. And I always like to throw in that grief, having experienced a lot of that, is not an afflictive emotion, okay? So nirvana is the extinction or the cessation of these 3 poisons. Okay? So through our ignorance, we try to pull towards us what we want, what's pleasurable, and push away what we don't want and what's unpleasant, right? Now there is a biological component to this. To keep the species alive, we need to pull towards us what helps us survive, right? And to push away that danger. So there is a biological component of that. But then there's all this overlay, right? That's really what we're focused on. So ignorance is taking ourselves, others, and all phenomena to be permanent, solid, and separate. So you hear a lot of talk about impermanence in Buddhism, right? And we think, well, I know I'm going to die, but we don't live knowing that, right? We take ourselves, we're always reifying and concretizing this that we take ourselves to be. Identifying with the body, with our thoughts, emotions, ideas, and opinions, right? That obviously create a lot of suffering for ourselves and others. So this not being permanent or separate or solid. So not separate, there's this incredible interdependency, this cause and effect. For example, let's say you're wearing a cotton shirt today. If you just sit and contemplate that cotton shirt coming to be where you can wear it. What all had to come to be so that you even had the money or the means to get to the store to buy that shirt. All that had to come into being for that store to be there, for that shirt to be there on the shelf, for the people that had to work there, all that had to come into being for you to be there, for them to be there, for the store to be there, for the shirt to be there, for the shirt to be trucked there, for cotton to be grown, for the fields and the cotton to be harvested, spun, and dyed. That's a lot when we start and these are what the teachings have us do, really contemplate this interdependency and how nothing is separate. If something comes into being because there was all these other things that were there for it to arise. So it's really profound and amazing. So we take and we reify and we concretize what we perceive. It's this shirt, and it's separate, and it's mine, and it's solid, it's going to last, and then it doesn't. It gets stained, and then we're unhappy, and we got to get another shirt, right? So we don't see that the impermanence, the interconnectedness, right? And it's not solid, which quantum physics and physics helps us kind of help understand that lack of solidity more. But in the traditional teachings, they may take a table and say, where's the tableness in this table? Is it the top? Is it the legs? Is it this side of the leg? Is it that side of the leg? Where's the tableness in the table? So Buddhism isn't just about studying and having a bunch of ideas, it's really examining. And Buddha said to us, don't believe it because I say it. So it's not based on belief. It's based on what he suggested of take it, study it, contemplate it, look within your own heart and mind, and see if it's true for you. Right? So it's not based on belief. So there are, like I alluded to, different schools of Buddhism, Theravada, which you find mostly in Southeast Asia, Mahayana, Tibet, China, Japan, and others. I won't be able to name all of them. Vajrayana, you can find mainly in Tibetan Buddhism, which is also Mahayana and Vajrayana. So in the Mahayana, when that developed, we have this concept of the Bodhisattva, the practitioner that wants to attain enlightenment in order to help other beings. Now, I had always heard, or I heard until my teachers corrected, or I had this idea, I don't know where I got it, that I was going to have to forego enlightenment as a bodhisattva before I got everybody else across the line. I was like, something's wrong with this picture, otherwise, if nobody crosses that line, we're all not going to be enlightened. And so, thankfully, my teachers have said, no, a bodhisattva has the heart and mind of practicing and attaining enlightenment for the sake of all beings, to be able from that place be able to truly help other beings. So I was like, okay, that sounded a little bit easier. Well, not easy, but a little bit better. Yeah, and also it's important that, like, even if we take one word in the teachings, Not only is it different across the different schools, Theravada and Mahayana, Vajrayana, and how they might teach about that, but even in Mahayana, depending on the teachings, that one word or concept can have different ways that it's taught, different nuances or subtleties. And especially when we get into translating a language like Sanskrit or Pali or Tibetan into English, those terms have subtleties that are there in the original language that we don't have. So like suffering, really also you get it translated as unsatisfactoriness. Right? So wisdom and compassion are at the heart of the teachings, because through understanding, through this deep investigation of our own heart and mind, taking those teachings inside, we gain that understanding and compassion for our own human predicament, and then compassion for others. And we have to turn towards ourselves with compassion, because judgment is just continuing, right, that cycle, right? But you also can't have one without the other. Compassion, or wisdom without compassion becomes cold. Compassion without wisdom can be emotionality, right? So it's important that we have both of those. You often hear it taught, they are two wings of a bird, two wings of a bird. So I'm going to try a little bit to follow the 5
Principles.
I can't promise, okay? So Buddhism is non-theistic. So if you hear the term God, which you will in Tibetan Buddhism, there's lots of gods and goddesses in Tibetan Buddhism, right? But there's not a creator God. So there isn't that concept. Like I said, that's part of the realm of existence. So Buddha did not find a fixed, permanent, separate entity nor a first cause. And it's even said that the absolute or Buddhahood, don't cling to that. Don't try and reify that or make that a thing. So, and he also did not find what he would call, or what is called a soul or an Atman, that goes from one lifetime to the next unchangingly. Because he found everything is changing. We're changing all the time, right? We're always changing. Always changing. So there is rebirth and reincarnation. Rebirth is, for someone like me that's unenlightened, that whatever my propensities, whatever I've cultivated, is said to be in a mind stream, but that mind stream can change. It can change between birth and our death and rebirth. Whatever those propensities, whatever I cultivated, whatever I focused on. So for me, it's probably going to be a lot of craving for dark chocolate. So where is that craving going to take me in my next birth, right? Now, reincarnation, you often hear about Tibetan lamas, high teachers, reincarnating in order to help other beings. They've clarified their mind to the point where they can choose. Where someone like me, I'm going to be propelled, it's not going to be a choice, into a next birth, right? See the difference?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see that. I am. So the truth of our being is not an I or a me. So it's the not self. So this is one of Buddha's tools, putting an end to clinging and to rarefying and concretizing an I or a me as a solid, separate thing, right? That this teaching of not self. So he did not affirm or deny the existence of a self, because here we are, right? So we can't say there's not something here that denies what's happening. We talked about the process by which the mind creates many senses of a self. What he called I-making or my-making. We can call it the ego or egoing as a verb, this constant creating of a self. And it's pursuing what it desires, right? That pulling towards or pushing away. And it's because the clinging lies at the heart of suffering, because there's clinging in each sense of self. He advised using the perception of not self as a strategy to dismantle that clinging. But it's also important that we don't cling at any experience of not self, no matter how grand or transcendent it is, that we don't cling to that either, because that's just more clinging that creates suffering. So now you will find in Mahayana teachings there is what's called Buddha nature, right? You've probably heard of that. You will not find that, in my understanding, you will not find that in Theravada teachings, right? So, this I am in Buddha speak would be not necessarily the I part, but how about that am part? Maybe more of the isness, the amness, right? Some words that you would find more in Mahayana, Vajrayana teachings that point to this is radiant awareness and spaciousness, that your being, true being, beyond all that clinging and all that stuff, the afflictive emotions, is this spacious, awake radiance. Like the sky, it has no beginning, it has no end. The phenomenon of our experiences are like the clouds. They arise, they pass away. But that doesn't change the sky. So that right here, where you're sitting in these seats, you are a Buddha from the Mahayana Vajrayana perspective, right? So beyond the clinging, there's no need to try and get union to anything because you are already that. So this, the I think. So our ignorance is based on our conditioned way of perceiving ourselves in the world and a phenomena, which gives rise to our thoughts and our beliefs and our opinions, which creates this cycle of suffering, right? So when we're working with our heart, mind, and also it's important in Buddhism, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, when they're talking about the mind, there's either the conceptual mind or kind of more of the enlightened mind, but they're talking in that sense about the heart. So it's not separate from the heart. So when we're working with our conceptual mind, our heart, we watch our thoughts, we become familiar with them, we gain insight into the conditioned mind, our attachments, aversions, and ignorance. And so by studying and contemplating, we begin to see the more subtle levels of our conditioning and how it's causing suffering. And believe me, this just seems to be more and more subtle layers and levels when we start looking at our own psyche and our being. But this allows us to gain more wisdom and compassion for ourselves and others. Let me get a little drink of water.
Sure.
I have a few minutes, and I think I may have missed. Yeah, there was something I wanted to read here on page 114, if you don't mind me doing so. So this is about not finding first cause. So he talks about that he has developed extraordinary, this is Buddha speaking, this book uses his teachings to tell the story of his life. I'm going to give these at the end, is that okay? So he says, I have developed extraordinary powers of perceptions, and I've developed such higher forms of knowledge, yet I was not able to perceive the first beginning of the universe, nor have I perceived a permanent and eternal substance in the world or in man. I have not seen an ultimate reality, indefinable and inexpressible. This is someone that asked him a question about it directly. How can one explain what one has not experienced? Shouldn't one remain silent? It felt like every action, even if you unknowingly stepped on a little bug, every action they felt like was going to produce, like that would produce some bad karma. Buddha did not see it that way. That's not what he saw or discovered. He said, not everything we experience is due to our past karma, and not all karma produces consequences. And it's not a form of punishment. So I'm going to read from here again. Let's see. First, I do not consider karma to be an immutable law. I do not believe that everything we experience now is due to our past karma. For I find that not all karmas produce consequences. Thirdly, I do not look upon the effect of karma as a form of punishment. And finally, I am willing to attribute responsibility to the doer of an action only if that action is consciously done. Therefore, in my view, mental action is more blameworthy than the mere physical act. So this too can be very subtle because we can think, well, I didn't mean to hurt that person. But we got to look deeper. What was our intention and motivation? And there may have been some unknown, unconscious intentions or motivations that are behind what we think, say, or do. So, something to keep in mind. So prayer and meditation, obviously there's a lot of that going on in Buddhism. So with an emphasis on meditation, and in Mahayana and Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism, what I'm familiar with, when you get into prayers, visualizations, it's still that, and even if you're working with a deity, the whole purpose, at some point it goes from being something outside yourself to seeing yourself as the deity. And it's all again to realize, but to clear out those clouds, to clear out the clouds, right? So that our own Buddha nature can shine through. So through meditation, we can watch our conditioned mind, the thoughts, emotions, sensations arise and pass away. So we become familiar with impermanence, right? We can become familiar with the inseparability, that there has to be something here for there even to be an arising of the thoughts and emotions, right? There's these causes and conditions. And therefore, we lessen the clinging to them. So, through the I do, through cultivation of wisdom and compassion, we're better able to reduce suffering in ourselves and for others by taking wise action in our lives and in the world. So, in closing, I think I did pretty good on time.
You did.
So, in closing, Buddhist teaching guides us to become familiar with, embrace, and take responsibility for all parts of our lives and ourselves. So it's not a denial of our humanity, it's a turning towards those difficult emotions, giving space to them, because to judge them just is going to solidify them in our system, right? So this is turning towards owning the good, the bad, and the ugly, to cultivating the good parts, the virtues and the qualities. And by seeing it all without judgment, with honesty and compassion, we are helping dissipate those clouds that obscure our radiant heart mind that is already and always present. So that's the end of that. And I did want to make 3 book suggestions if you're interested in further study. The first one is called The Way of Siddhartha, A Life of the Buddha, by David Kalupahani.
Here, I'll hold up.
You want to be Dana?
There we go.
Yeah, it's what they did is they wrote a narrative story of the Buddha's life using his teachings and taking out, when someone is born, they become a teacher, there can become all this mystical way of viewing them. And so he kind of took that out and made him the real person that he was, using his teachings and then adding it to it some. And then this next book is called Dancing with Life, Buddhist Insights, classes for finding meaning and joy in the face of suffering, by Philip Moffat. And this, he explores the 4 Noble Truths in a very grounded, relevant way, using stories about his own students. He's a meditation teacher. So one of my teachers recommended, he's a Tibetan, Nam Thupten Rinpoche. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's taught here in Little Rock. He recommended that our group study this book, and I found it very helpful. And then this book is called In Love with the World, A Monk's Journey Through the Bardos of Living and Dying. This is written by a Tibetan monk who's a Rinpoche. They don't normally tell you their experiences, good, bad, or whatever. They don't feel like, they're very humble in that way. They don't share it. And he shared about his life and his journey from his panic attacks on to leaving his high position of being the head of monasteries, escaping during the night and going out on his own to really go more deeply to examine his own mind when there weren't all the constraints of his responsibilities. This is a lovely, lovely book, really showing how we can use the teachings in our own lives, and then his experience of awakening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much.
I was sitting there just nodding my head. I was feeling, in unity we see things rightly. So I really had a lot of connections with what you said. The 8 paths, the 12 powers that we have in unity. They're not exactly the same, but there really is that commonality. And I love it that you emphasize he just wanted to know about suffering. What could we do about that? So thank you so much. So for now, we're going to do, so we're going to go back to this. We're going to do musical meditation, thanks to Karen Drucker. We're going to do the loving kindness meditation.